Faith Jone is a powerhouse attorney who turned a childhood of trauma into a platform to raise up and empower others. Raised to be part of an elite religious army preparing for the end times, Faith grew up in a cult called the Children of God that had been founded by her grandfather. Finally, at the age of 23, thirsting for knowledge and freedom, she broke away, leaving everything she knew behind to forge her own path in America. Today, Faith now runs her own law practice after graduating summa cum laude from Georgetown School of Foreign Service with honors from UC Berkeley Law School. Faith is a passionate advocate for women's empowerment and business leadership and has written a guidebook called I Own Me, where she shares tools to heal from physical violations and provides a framework to set boundaries. More recently, Faith wrote a powerful memoir called Sex Cult Nun, where she recounts her personal journey of being raised as a member of the Children of God. I am so pleased to speak with you today, Faith. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. And thank you so much for, all that you do to put out empowering information to people, because that's your gift. And so I want to thank you for doing that.
You certainly have an incredible story, and you've been very fortunate to be able to turn your childhood trauma to a platform to help advocate and empower women. So tell us a little more of your story and time in the cult and how this shaped your future self.
There's quite a lot of famous people that have been in this group. Rose McGowan, the Phoenix siblings, and quite a few others. And there have been quite a few stories written about it. There have been a number of documentaries written about it, produced about it. And when I was writing my story, I wanted to write something that was a little bit different, because not only because of sort of the position that my family held, but also the fact that I spent my entire childhood up until my early 20s in it. I wanted to write the story from the perspective of somebody who was in it, not the perspective of somebody looking back on it. But more importantly, I wanted to write it from a sense of how I experienced it, how I saw these things from my perspective as a child, even various forms of what I now recognize as abuse, but I didn't know it was abuse at the time when I was a small child and asked to engage in sexual activities with men I didn't want to. I didn't recognize it for what it was, because I had been raised to view it from a particular perspective, that this was good and godly. This was what our conduct was supposed to be, right? And so I wanted to show it from that perspective, because I think a lot of times people wonder, how do people end up in cults? How do they accept these types of, when you're outside the group, it just sounds crazy. And they don't understand how people can get drawn in, how they can get sucked in, how they can be kind of manipulated and coerced into staying and doing things that really go against their own self-interest completely. And this story chronicles my life in the group and many different experiences that happened to me from the time I was a small child, around 4 years old, and all the way up until I leave the group, then where I reach the point that I create basically a framework or a new way of looking at the world that allows me to reclaim my sense of self-ownership and to understand the abuses that had happened in the group, why they happened and what they were. And to me, to create something to say, this can help us make sure these things don't happen again.
Why do you think that some people can be so easily manipulated by these religious groups? That they give up their sense of self and beliefs.
They've done some studies asking this question, and they found something quite surprising, that the kinds of people that are susceptible to this, more susceptible to this, or targeted by cults, are actually people who are intelligent, who are generally good-natured and optimistic and idealistic.
Wow.
And I mean, this is the kind of people you want for a friend in a lot of ways, right? Those are the people they target. They don't want someone who's going to cause a lot of trouble. They have to be quite optimistic in order to swallow a lot of stuff that a more cynical person wouldn't. And these people join out of a strong sense of idealism, wanting to make the world a better place, wanting to create a better society, and so on and so forth. And it's not that it could happen to anybody, but it could happen to a lot more people than you think if the conditions are correct. And even within our society today, I see so much kind of cultish behavior of this, like extreme tribalism and us and them, and kind of the demonization of the other, and closing ourselves off to analytical or critical thinking about certain topics that just kind of inflame, and when you're part of groups, if you start questioning the core principles, and I mean, it could be anything from CrossFit to Soul Cycle to, an MLM, then you get pushed out and you get rejected by the group, right? So there's elements of this that exist in society, and even within the group itself, and sometimes they're not bad, right? Sometimes we need this kind of cohesiveness and community, and we want to be part of a group and feel accepted and loved, and that's a thing that cults do. That's what they do really well. They make you feel special and part of a community, and that you're part of our family, and they kind of love bomb you, and right. So they create this thing, a sense of belonging that people and purpose that people really want. And so that's why to me, being able to see it and say, okay, I can see there were good elements, people lived together, everybody helped each other, mothers had help with the kids and the cooking. And, so there was a sense of this kind of older community style of raising kids and everything. And, it's very idealistic, but I was like, well, is it possible to have the good without the bad? And how can we identify what went wrong? What was that seed of corruption that created all of this abuse that a lot of people suffered from? And yet, they joined for all of the good things that they were trying to get and to create. And yet they ended up being subject to some terrible abuses and perpetuating abuses on others.
You talk a lot about the trauma that you experienced and others in your community experience. And so you obviously healed from your own trauma. So you have a deep seated belief that that's possible for everyone, for most.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's one of the things that is most important for me to share, is that you can heal, and that is possible. First of all, I think you have to start by believing that you can heal. And I think it's part of it is that commitment to that journey, and not being like, oh, well, I tried this and it didn't work, so that's it, right? I mean, I've tried all kinds of stuff. So I remember I was probably around 10 or 12, and I realized, that I was really responsible for myself, and that I was responsible for my actions, my outcome in life. That somebody had told me, your parents make mistakes and they're going to do stuff, and it is what it is, but ultimately you're responsible for what you do. That is one of the things that shaped me, but it continues to shape me. And when I created this framework, I saw that was one of the core kind of truths that you could say, is that ultimately, when I understand that I own myself, then if I fully own myself, then I'm also fully responsible for what I do. Doesn't mean that other people haven't impacted me, but in this moment, I am the only person that can create my own happiness. Like, some people are waiting for someone to apologize when they ask, like, did your parents apologize? And I was like, you know what? Eventually they did, but that didn't really matter. I wasn't waiting for them to apologize for me to heal. That was like them apologizing and recognizing that, it's allowed us to have a closer relationship than we might otherwise have. But I wasn't waiting for that for me.
How powerful. And to learn that at 10, I mean, there's people who would never learn that in their entire life. How do we help our daughters and other young women who are in our lives learn how to set healthy boundaries for themselves so that they're not caught up in this type of world or experience or setting?
And even worse than caught up in this type of world or experience, I was just listening to a podcast today about how prevalent grooming is online, in social media, and sexual trafficking of teens and of young people, kids and teens, just in daily society. It was talking about how if you have kids and they have a smartphone, they have seen pornography and they have been sexually solicited on, Snapchat or whatever it is. So recognizing that this is not just something you need to be concerned about, some cult's going to come along.
Right.
This is like literally happening right now to your kids on a daily basis. Bearing that in mind, I think it's just so much more critical that we give our kids the framework and these principles. I call them the 10 immutable principles of conduct, TIPOC. And it's basically, you start with the understanding that I own myself, that I own my body. My body is my property. Nobody gets to touch it. Nobody gets to pressure me into doing anything with it without my full free permission. Talk to them about how do you engage with others? How do you have these conversations with others? And I don't know that there is a time when it's too early to start talking to them about these principles, because you can, start it just from the simplest thing of like, don't hit Susie. That's her body, is her property, right? You don't get to touch her. You don't get to bite her, right? It's based on the fundamental principles of property rights. Because what I realized, I talk about this in my TEDx talk, because I had been raised with the values that I didn't own my body, that it wasn't my property, that it belonged to God, but really they meant it belonged to the group, and that I had to use it for whatever I was told to do. I had to submit and yield and, all of these types of things that they often teach women in these kinds of organizations. Didn't know what the right sense of boundaries was. How do you create that when you didn't start with that? So when I understood this as a lawyer, I understood the concept of property rights very clearly. And I think that men especially understand those principles very clearly for themselves, because they're raised with a very different self-view of themselves, but not of women necessarily, right? So it gives us a common language that we can use to talk between men and women about, you respect it, this is why, if you grab my butt, you don't have to harm me. I don't have to be physically damaged for it to be bad. You violated my property.
You're focusing on the message when kids are young to build them up to understand these basic principles, that if you haven't been raised with them, you're not going to understand that your body, yourself, you're your own property and people can't violate it. So the younger you can start, the better.
That's what's so important about teaching, young people these principles. It gives them a conviction. Like, I know I'm right, and you shouldn't do this to me, right? It just totally changes your demeanor versus someone who is confused and is like, is this right? Isn't it right? Should he be doing this? Should I be doing this? I don't know, right? You're all of a sudden in such a place of weakness when you're experiencing that, versus when you're like, hey, I know you're not supposed to pressure me, so that you're not supposed to touch me like that. That doesn't feel right. I already know. So back off, right? It totally changes how you interact in the world.
Absolutely. You're coming from a position of power and strength. So what are the most important things you want people to take away from your story?
First of all, I think, as you mentioned earlier, that, a lot of bad stuff happens to many of us, some worse than others, right? But you definitely can heal and recover from it if that is what you truly want to do, if that really is your goal. That is possible. And the other one is, I think the most important is this framework, really understanding it. And so definitely I go through it fully on my TEDx talk, which is called I Own Me. I also have videos on my YouTube channel, Faith Jone's Author, where I go through it, but really grasping this for yourself, understanding what each of these property rights are, and how you can share that with other people in your life and teach that. But it's the underlying principles of integrity for everything in our lives, from business to our personal relationships and how we show up in relationships. So that's why I think it's just so critical. I say live free and harm none. That's our goal, right? We want to have as much freedom to really be empowered and choose our own path and be our authentic self without allowing our freedom to damage other people or harm them. And that's what happened in that group, in the Children of God. Certain people were taking their freedoms, but they were hurting others because they didn't have they didn't understand what the clear boundary lines were.
Mm-hmm. I really love what you're doing I'm an advocate and I love to empower women. This is my little passion project. And, I mentioned being in the financial industry for a long time and seeing what I saw there. And then in the health and wellness field that I'm in now, trying to spread some messaging around taking back that power for your own health. This all beautifully ties in and why it's so powerful that we educate ourselves, we remain open to information and looking for help and asking for help and getting all those amazing tools that are out there. This is just another great tool for women to explore. So I really appreciate your time today. And, your message is incredibly powerful and I know you're changing lives.
Thanks for having me. And thank you again for the good work that you're doing. Appreciate it.